I'd like everyone to welcome our guest artist today, Nate Young. And Nate is a professor in studio arts at the University of Illinois. He's also represented by Monica Minoche Gallery in Chicago, which is very excellent gallery there, and they do a lot of experimental artists. And I met Nate here in Des Moines. He's from Minneapolis, right? Not St. Paul, but Minneapolis. And he was doing really innovative things there. Was it the Bindery that your space was called? And again, Nate is very experimental. He's very reflective. He's a master craftsman, and it's a lot of people just stop there in their lives. You know, that's enough to be so skilled and be able to build anything out of wood and so on. But that was just a vehicle for him to be thinking all the time about different ideas. And I think that's all I'm going to say because everyone wants to hear you. So thank you very much. Let's all welcome Nate Young.
So maybe I'll just go through some images and talk about the work that I've been thinking about. Specifically, I know Lenore wanted me to share a little bit about two of the works that were in the show that you all have seen. I'm actually in my office right now, and when I got here and was looking through images, I realized I didn't have those images on the hard drive that I have today, but I'm assuming you all have seen the two pieces that were in the show. So the two pieces that Lenore was referring to, both are pieces that were works that I made when I was still in graduate school. One of them is, and they were both, I think, in my last year of graduate school. And the way I was thinking about those works, and maybe the way that I still think about both of those works, is that those were the last works that I made that were about race. Because they sort of were, and at the same time sort of weren't about race, but more about my thinking around systems that produce our ability to think about racial categorizations. The title of this piece is A Container for the Projection of a Political Assertion, posited by a Negro artist. And I mean, in some ways, like I said, this piece in my mind was the last piece that I made that was specifically about race. So I had thought about it for a long time as a pivot point for me, one away from representation and toward thinking about the title and the text as a way of contextualizing the material in the work. So all it is a glass of a glass that's filled with water all the way to the top, and then at the top there's like a convex. The way that the water is shaped at the top is so filled that it creates a convex at the top of the glass. So the glass is full, completely full of water. And in a way, I mean, what I was at the time when I thought about this piece, it was maybe in response to the presumption oftentimes that no matter what I did, the work somehow was talked about in relation to some idea of race, even if the work didn't specifically address those ideas, that my identity, or I mean, I guess you could say in general, one's identity is, well, especially non-white male identities, are presumed to have some kind of relationship to the subject in the work. So it was a little bit tongue in cheek. Um, but at the same time, I realized that all of those like things could be projected onto the object that weren't necessarily there, and that um, the context in which we understand any object is based on our social political uh, presumptions. Like we understand a river because of language and social context. So there could be things about Blackness that are related to the politics of water, even though that wasn't what it wasn't something that I was trying to forefront in the work. There could be presumptions that would make sense about Blackness, Negro-ness, and art making in relation to this glass of water. But really, at the end, those things are only there because of what the audience presumes the work is about, and the title leads one in that direction. So.
Does anyone have any questions about this? And while you think about this, Nate, I actually have a question. Why did you use the word Negro artist in this piece? While you're talking about Black artists, but the title of the piece uses the word Negro, which is sort of by now a little bit archaic. So so it has that that feeling of a kind of a 19th century idea.
I mean, I think the entire title, like I said, is a little bit tongue in cheek, and by using the word Negro, I wanted to emphasize that I was sort of like I thought it was funny, you know, because it's so dated. It sort of doesn't make sense in the way that the proposition almost doesn't make any sense.
Hi, I'm Lily.
And Lily is actually writing about you for the show and for the catalog.
Cool.
So
one of the questions that just kind of came up in my brain was, I guess, why is the glass all the way full? And like you kind of mentioned, like the convex, and I guess, is it important that this glass has kind of that tension at the top?
Yeah. I mean, at the time, I was thinking a couple of things about um, the object, about the container being full, because it doesn't have any space for it to hold anything else. It's holding everything that it can hold. I mean, I think about empty. I think in a lot of my work for a long time, I was thinking about how we understand the world and the frameworks, or I might say scaffold. For instance, language, I think of as a framework through which we can understand the world, or systems of categorization as a framework. So in that sense, I think about them as containers for ideas, like language as a container for an idea. But this particular container is full. It can't hold any ideas. It doesn't have the capacity to get like one more drop, and it'll spill over. So yeah, I mean, that was for me, that's how I was thinking about that tension between like a proposition that the object had the capacity to do more, even though its capacity is um, exhausted, already exhausted. I don't know.
Yeah.
You had like more than one question in there, but I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, that was great. And then another question that I had is, guess, kind of the first thing I noticed with the piece is just how it's like placed very like close to the ground, I guess, and like just thinking about, I don't know why is it so low to the ground? I don't know. I was just kind of curious.
The first time I showed this piece, I just put it on the floor of the gallery. And the thing I like about it when it's on the floor in the gallery is that it actually disappears for the most part. I mean, it becomes very, very difficult to see. And I've shown it like this, you know, I mean, like this is a way to show it so that it doesn't get stepped on, because it, you know,
Sure.
at an opening or something, it gets knocked over, which is okay. But this was another way to show it. I mean, I like the fact that it was almost invisible. I like the fact of it potentially being invisible and not being seen. And I've shown it in other shows where I've had other work in the show, and it's just like in the corner, and like nobody sees it because it disappears. And yeah, I felt like that added to the idea, um, that, you know, not only is its capacity to contain anything more exhausted, but it's almost impossible to see. Like it could be this artwork that no one ever sees, hiding in plain sight. Um, this is actually, I was calling this post Black Magic #2, and there was a post Black Magic #3, um, and there might be a #4 because I'm in the process of renovating. I moved recently to a new studio. So the idea when I initially made this piece in my studio, I was in graduate school, and then I moved. Um, actually, this is #3. Anyway, the idea was that this video is performed in my studio, and what happens is in the video is that it's a shot that looks like a still shot because nothing is moving in the studio, and then I appear in the studio, and when I appear, I'm sort of uh, I fade in from nothing, and you can see in this still that I'm sort of translucent. My body is translucent, and then once I appear, I sort of do this motion and sort of like act like I'm trying really hard to do something, and as I'm doing that, my body starts to disappear. And I do that over and over again until I completely disappear. And in Post Black Magic #1, I disappear from the studio scene, and then I reappear in another frame that's all black. And then I do the same thing and I disappear out of that space, leaving only my hands. And as I'm disappearing, I'm sort of shaking my body like this. And then when I fully disappear, my hands are still present with white gloves against a black background. The hands continue to kind of make a shaking movement like this. Um, and the term post-Black is a term that comes from an essay, uh, I think is based on a conversation between Glenn Ligon and Thelma Golden about a group of artists that were in the show in 2001 called Freestyle. Um, and the idea was that these artists, this group of artists in a specific generation, were making work that was Black, but wasn't directly addressing ideas of Blackness in a conventional way. So I think some of the people who are in that show are this artist, Dave McKenzie. Um, I think that Layla Ali was in that show, Rashid Johnson. Um, I want to say Kara Walker, but I might not be right about that. Um, Edgar Arsenal was in that show. Um, there were probably about 20 artists in that show. And I was thinking about the potential of, it's funny because I actually haven't thought about this piece in a long time because it's been, I don't know, almost 15 years since I initially made this work. And the idea was that every time I moved to a new studio, I would remake this piece. I'm in the process of moving into a new studio, so I probably will revisit this idea again. But I was thinking at the time about uh, the potential of being post-Black or post-racial and what that potentially would mean. Um, would that mean non-existence? Um, because in order to be post-Black, in a way, the only way that you would know that something was post-Black is because it was Black in the first place, and it would still have to have some kind of Blackness in order to be identified as post-Black. Neither do I think that we live in or even have the capacity to imagine post something that would be post-racial or particularly post-Black. So again, there's like, I was interested in what that would actually look like, you know, that the absence of Blackness actually, or even maybe the existence of Blackness actually shows up as a non-thing, a nothing, a nothingness. More recently, I've been thinking a lot about and reading a lot of contemporary Black studies, and been particularly interested in what a genre of contemporary Black studies called Afro-pessimism, which is a term that was it's something that these two writers were called sort of as a diss, but then they adopted the term, and those two theorists are Saidiya Hartman and Frank Wilderson. And Afro-pessimism essentially, if I could describe it in short, is the idea that Blackness is excluded from the category of the human. Not only is it excluded from the category of human, it is the exclusion of Blackness that allows humanness to even know its existence. So there's an idea that Blackness comes out of, like, Blackness knows itself because it's not white. Afro-pessimism argues rather that whiteness and humanness in and of itself only knows itself in relation to Blackness. So Blackness precedes the idea of the human. Obviously, or maybe not so obviously, or maybe you could feel it in when I say that, this is a kind of a controversial idea. Some people really don't like this idea because they don't say, I'm Black and I'm human. What you have to realize is that there's a difference between humanness in the way that they're defining humanness and being a sentient being. Black people are sentient beings, but within the categories of human that we live within, that Blackness is excluded from that category. Like it or not, this is not a theory that I came up with. I'm just repeating what I heard. You can argue with me. I mean, I don't necessarily call myself an Afro-pessimist, but I think that this idea of Blackness and its exclusion from the category of human also leads to this what Fred Moten, another theorist who's sort of Afro-pessimist adjacent, calls for, which is a new theory of nothingness. Because if Blackness is not included within the category of human, Blackness essentially is nothing. And that nothingness is what thingliness can define itself against. Fred Moten doesn't throw out the idea of nothingness. Rather, he embraces it to think about the potential that nothingness would produce. This is what differentiates him from a pure Afro-pessimist, because a pure Afro-pessimist is not interested in what can be reclaimed from the nothingness, but I think more in terms of what the potential of the non-space gives us. I wasn't thinking about these two works in those terms when I made them, but I tend to think about them more in that way now. That the glass of water, because it's clear, because it's translucent, because it's invisible, to me is very similar to the black empty space.
A question I have is, just to be clear, when you're talking about nothingness, there's two questions. Is the nothingness opposed to humanness? Is it kind of a binary, either you're human or you're nothing? And second of all, is the nothingness a positive thing to be? In other words, I think you mentioned it was filled with potential. Is any of that potential realized, or is it just a potential space? Or is it negative to be in nothingness? So those are my questions.
I think there are negative implications, which is why I think a lot of people have issue with this Afro-pessimist theory. Is it binary? Maybe. I mean, the other term that the Afro-pessimists use to describe the nothingness of blackness is social death. That the that blackness, because of its exclusion from the category of the human, has no relational capacity. That humans have relational capacity, and that blackness is excluded from participation, therefore has no relational capacity. And of course, yeah, there are negative implications. I mean, the negative implications we see played out on a daily, well, I mean, yeah, on a daily basis. But I mean, then there are like, spikes of general awareness, i.e., like Frank Wilderson has a line in his book, Red, White, and Black, where he says something along the lines of, we'll know that blackness has relational capacity when black bodies no longer magnetize bullets. So social death and actual literal death are an outcome of blackness exclusion and situation within the non-being, the nothingness. Now, there are other theorists that I'm interested in that would say, for instance, Fred Moten uses the analogy of the ship, the slave ship, the Middle Passage, and the hold of the ship as a space where the subjectivity of the slave is stripped away, so that the slave no longer is a living being, a human being. Rather, they are a cargo, an object, and the stripping of that subjectivity happens within the hold of the ship in that transition period. And he argues in this essay, Blackness and Nothingness, that that possibly there's something to be claimed, or there's something of potential that could be claimed within that whole, that maybe the potential to think about ourselves, and not just blackness, but all people, in a different way, would have to come out of a paradigm shift that would be so radical that we would no longer think of ourselves as human. None of us. It's not that black people join the human category, it's that the category is obliterated in and of itself. So I think in that sense that that's, for me at least, in my thinking, that's where the potential comes from, is not holding on to humanness and reclaiming its benefits, or trying to join that category, rather like moving everyone toward a new category of thinking about our being in the world. I mean, science fiction does this a lot. I'm really into science fiction and thinking about like what other kinds of ways of being could be possible, but they would have to come out of some other state of being, like a clean slate of nothing. So, okay, I'm fast forwarding to like this work is from probably a good 10 years after those two pieces that we started with. So this, I would say, is around 2018. And after I made that piece where I disappear into the black space, I started thinking about that black space as a space that, instead of existing in video, I wanted that space to exist in real space, like that one could go into that black space and experience the void. Maybe it's a metaphor for the void of subjectivity, but and I started thinking about what potentially could exist there. So this image is not a good image, only because I only show this image in order to describe what this piece actually was, because you couldn't really. I'll describe the piece. So I did this show in Richmond, Virginia, where I was commissioned to make a new work, and what I did was I completely light locked the gallery space, so that when you entered in, you entered through a series of curtains and doors, and when you got all the way into the space, it was completely black. There was a sound in the space, and the sound was a sound of these bones being handled, and when they touch each other, they kind of make a clanking sound. And I recorded this in my studio, and then at a certain point, I would drop the bones on the ground. And when the bones dropped on the ground, they made a different kind of sound, a much louder, like crashing sound. And when that sound happened, that's when a light came on, just for a fraction of a second, and illuminated this collection of bones that were on the ground. And there were several of them around this big, cavernous, dark, empty space. And but if you weren't looking in the exact spot at the right time, you wouldn't see it. And even if you were looking in the right spot, in the right, quote unquote, right spot, if you were looking at the spot where the bones were, you would only see a flash. What you would actually see is the after image, because the flash was so fast that the after image would stay in your retina or in your brain for longer than what you actually saw in the physical space. Let me back up, and I'm going to go through some of these images as I give you some backstory about this project that's ongoing and is what I'm still working on to this day. My great-grandfather migrated from what I now know was North Carolina to Philadelphia in the early 1900s, and around 1920, which was the start of the Great Migration. He left, and I know the stories about him through my grandmother. He left under some kind of duress. She said they were trying to get him. If you know the story of the Great Migration, a lot of folks left because they were looking for better jobs, better educational opportunities, better opportunities for their children, and so on. The other part of that story is that a lot of people were actually forced to leave because it was dangerous. And from what I gather, he was in some kind of situation like that. I later found out, and when I first found out, when I first heard his story, it was because my brother had found a photograph of him, my great-grandfather, my father's mother's father. And in the photograph, he's standing next to a horse. I later found out that the horse was the vehicle of his flight, that he was a fugitive who left the South, ended up in Philadelphia, and he rode this horse. Because they were potentially looking for him, he buried the horse in like a secret location that I later found the location of the burial, and I exhumed the bones. initially I was thinking about the bones as a kind of, like I talked about earlier, a framework for ideas. For instance, if you could like roll the bones on the ground and then read the bones, you might be able to receive some kind of divine messages from God. This is a sort of like an ancient practice. But the idea is that you needed some kind of object, or even I would argue now that some kind of object proves not only the existence of God or um, a particular idea, but even the very idea that I exist, or the idea that my great grandfather exists, therefore I exist. So the bones for me became an object of ritual that I could then um, use to prove maybe my own existence. And so what you're looking at, these objects, these are prints with drawings on them. And there's another story about these that when I was in Richmond, Virginia, I heard this story about. I'll tell you the story quick about a train tunnel that was being created, and as they were digging the tunnel collapsed, and it collapsed on the back end of the of the train, and some people were trapped. Black folks at the back of the tunnel or at the back of the train were trapped in this tunnel. They couldn't, or allegedly, they tried to remove the debris to get the people out, and the tunnel collapsed more. So they sealed it, and to this day, the bodies of these people are still sealed in this tunnel. I mean, it was interesting to me that they didn't know how many people were there because at the time, most of those people were probably leaving the South and heading further north. And not, well, like my grandfather, a lot of folks who left ended up changing their names and didn't really ever go back. So they were sort of in the process of disappearing in the first place. Oh, the dirt that's on these drawings is dirt that I went back. I found the site of the train tunnel collapse, and I collected dirt from there in order to make parts of these drawings. I'm going to skip these for now and come back to some of these. This is a show from a couple of years ago where I used the bones again, but the bones are, I didn't have, these aren't in the best order. Let me go all the way to the end here. So toward the end of my great grandfather's life, he attempted suicide, and I used a letter that he wrote, like a suicide note, and I rewrote that letter in my own handwriting, and I used the bones as a kind of decoder. So the text is there, written in my handwriting, kind of as a painting. And when these doors close, a light comes on, which illuminates the bones and also illuminates certain words. And then when all of those words are put together, they form a sentence which refers to the location of the burial of the horse. This also was the first time I started thinking about Blackness and the relationship between nothingness and an alternative way of thinking about time. Maybe I'll come back to that idea, but I'll just say that obviously in this work, there's a certain amount of anachronism. What I mean is that if this text leads to the location of the burial of the horse, then I would have had to have the bones before I found the location of the bones. Also, they only work with my handwriting, not my great grandfather's handwriting. So there's a kind of anachronism, and they only work if I collapse the time that he existed in into the time that I existed in, which is the way that I've been thinking about time lately, and also the way that like physics thinks about time as nonlinear. Okay, let me go back, and talk about this. Um, this was a show that I did that also had to do with the bones. So I created this kind of, what I wanted to do was cut a hole in the gallery floor and bury some of the bones and then put cement back over. Um, and that would be the show. There would be nothing to see in the show except for like a newly poured square of concrete. Um, I wasn't able to do that in this space specifically. So what I did was created this kind of I don't know, just a little, I don't even know what to call it. Like you walk up these steps and at the top you look down and you can see the bones. But when you look down and see them, they're below the level of the floor. So the floor is like 6 feet from the top, but the bones are down another 2 feet. So when you're looking down, it's like disorienting and it looks like the bones are below, like there's a hole in the floor. And then I recreated a section of that concrete, the section that this, like the base, the square base down here covers. And I made a piece of concrete that's like a Trompe l'oeil painting of that section of the floor in the gallery. And then I made like a diagrammatic drawing. I don't have a close-up image of this piece. I made a diagrammatic drawing on the concrete, which correlates to this text that I drew on the wall of the gallery, which describes essentially some of the backstory that I was telling you about my great grandfather. So this particular text just says my great grandfather's name, and then my father's name, and then my name, because my great grandfather's name was passed on to my father and then passed on to me. And then this talks about his flight from North Carolina to Philadelphia. And I think there were like maybe 6 or 7 of them that tell different stories about him. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the work that I've been dealing with has to do with these bones. This is another work where the bones disappear. So in that very first piece in this series or in this body of work that I showed you, you're in a room that's dark, and then the bones appear. In this piece, the bones are on the inside of this object, but you can only see them when you're certain proximity to the piece. As you get closer to the piece, there's a light sensor that essentially makes the bones disappear, and this entire black area just goes completely black, and there's nothing there. So I think it was about 2 meters. Once you get closer than 2 meters away from this object, the bones disappear. And then you move away and eventually the light comes back on. But as soon as anyone gets too close to it, they disappear. I was thinking about this idea that, you want to get closer in order to see something, but as you get closer, it becomes less possible to understand what you're looking at, which is the opposite of how you would usually experience an object. Like closer proximity would give you more information, but in this case, the more you attempt to see it, the more it becomes impossible to see. This is my horse. His name is Jackson, and he's named after my great grandfather, whose name was William Nathaniel Jackson. I was thinking about, like, I would tell this story about my great grandfather, and the story is being told through the work, through performance, through the objects, through drawing. and people would often ask me how much of that story is true. And I had a couple of different answers, one of which is that I'm not necessarily interested in truth. I'm interested in reality. And I think that reality is something that we're constantly reconstructing. Um, and at a certain point, I started to, um, it was almost like I wasn't able to even answer the question because I didn't know the difference between truth and reality. Um, and it occurred to me that the only way for me to understand the reality of the past was to bring it into the present. So I'm currently in the process of training because I had never ridden horses before, but I'm in the process of training in order to recreate my great grandfather's journey from North Carolina to Philadelphia on horseback. In the meantime, these are some new drawings that I've been working on. And in all of the drawings, and I've probably made about 15 to 20 of these, maybe or so. But in all of the drawings, um, the source image is an image of my horse, along with an image of a figure, which is, I would say, is and is not me. I mean, it's based on me, but I'm always obscuring the figure in order that it could potentially be anyone. I like to think about the potential that it's not me, but it's my great grandfather, because the photograph, and again, like also this was a way for me to make a drawing based on the photograph that I referred to of my great grandfather standing next to his horse, which is a photograph that I haven't been able to retrieve. And I only saw it once, and that was like maybe 20 years ago. Um, this drawing in particular has a film over it. So part of the drawing is done on paper, and the other part of the drawing is done on a acetate film that hangs. This image, you can see how the acetate film layer hangs over the top, and part of the drawing is done on there. So as you move from different angles of viewing the drawing, parts of the drawing disappear. So this is just looking at the drawing from a little bit of an angle to the side, because the semi-translucent layer becomes more opaque from from an angle as opposed to right on. Here's another version. Oops. Where'd the rest of them go? I had a bunch of those in here. Yeah. Maybe I just had those three. This is another version. This one does not have the acetate layer. But what it does have is this kind of like blacking out of the figure, which I mean, in some ways really goes back to that work that that we started with the post-Black magic, the idea of occupying the void of subjectivity, you know, or like a kind of, I think that these drawings are kind of like deathly as well.